The penthouse on the 58th floor of Harrington Tower was the kind of place that appeared in architectural magazines and lifestyle blogs, described in breathless prose about clean lines and curated minimalism. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across 3 entire walls, offering a panoramic view of downtown Chicago that most people would have wept to see even once in their lifetimes. For Ethan Harrington, 33 years old and the sole heir to a $12 billion logistics empire, the view had stopped meaning anything approximately 4 years ago. He couldn't remember the exact date. That bothered him sometimes, in the rare quiet moments when he allowed himself to feel anything at all. There should have been a specific morning, some precise Tuesday or Thursday, when he had stood at that window and realized the city below him looked exactly like a very expensive screensaver. But memory had a way of blurring around grief, and Ethan had learned that truth the hard way after his father died and left him holding the weight of Harrington Global like an anvil wrapped in a silk handkerchief. He was already at his desk by 5:30 on the morning of October 14th. The kitchen staff didn't arrive until 6, which suited him fine. He had developed a habit of preparing his own morning coffee in those gray pre-dawn hours, a deliberate, almost meditative process involving a particular brand of single-origin Ethiopian roast that his assistant Marcus ordered in monthly shipments. The ritual was one of the few things left in his life that felt genuinely his own. No board meetings embedded in it. No shareholder expectations attached to it. Just the hiss of the espresso machine, the rich, dark smell curling through the sterile kitchen, and 30 seconds of something approaching peace. What Ethan did not know, on that particular October morning, was that something had gone wrong with his coffee. Not with the beans, not with the machine, not with his technique. Something that had arrived the previous afternoon in a small glass vial tucked inside a padded envelope, addressed to his personal chef. Something slipped into the carafe of his morning blend by hands that had smiled at him across a conference table just 48 hours before. Something that, according to the toxicologist who would examine it 3 days later, would have stopped his heart within 20 minutes of ingestion in a dosage that was precise, calculated, and merciless. But Ethan Harrington didn't drink that coffee. A 3-year-old girl named Lily made sure of it. The building's domestic staff rotated on a schedule managed by his head of household operations, a meticulous woman named Patricia who had run the administrative side of Ethan's private life for 6 years and who treated the penthouse roster with the precision of a military commander. There were 12 people on the domestic team. Cleaners, kitchen staff, a personal assistant who handled correspondence, a rotating pair of security personnel who stood at the elevator bank 22 floors below. Sophia Reyes had joined the team 11 weeks earlier. She was 28 years old, with dark eyes that held a particular quality of steadiness, the kind that comes not from an absence of hardship, but from having walked through enough of it to know you can keep walking. She had grown up in San Antonio, the daughter of a hotel housekeeper and a man who had left when Sophia was 9 and never explained why. She had worked her way through community college, studied for 2 years toward a nursing degree she'd had to abandon when her own mother's health deteriorated, and had spent the years since moving between service jobs in the hospitality industry with a quiet competence that made her supervisors consistently reluctant to see her go. She had Lily because she had loved a man named David, who turned out to be the kind of person who was wonderful right up until the moment he wasn't, and then was gone before Lily's first birthday. Sophia did not waste time being bitter about David. Bitterness was a luxury she couldn't afford, and besides, Lily was so thoroughly, extravagantly perfect that it was genuinely difficult to regret any chain of events that had resulted in her existence. Getting a position on the Harrington domestic staff had been a stroke of luck engineered by sheer persistence. The pay was exceptional. The hours were structured. Patricia, after an initial period of professional skepticism, had decided Sophia was reliable, careful, and discreet, the three qualities she valued above all others in her staff. There was only one complication. Lily. Patricia had not originally approved of the arrangement. The penthouse was a professional environment, she'd explained, and personal situations needed to remain personal. But Sophia's regular sitter had broken her ankle 5 weeks into the job, and Sophia had been desperate. The kind of desperate that sits very quietly in the chest and doesn't show on your face because showing it feels like losing. And Patricia, who had a granddaughter of her own, had made a single, unprecedented exception. Lily was allowed to accompany her mother on early morning shifts, provided she remained in the small staff break room adjacent to the kitchen, provided she was quiet, and provided she touched nothing. Lily had observed these rules with the flexible interpretation characteristic of 3-year-olds. She was not a destructive child. She was not loud or difficult or prone to tantrums in unfamiliar spaces. She was curious in the particular fearless way of small children who have been raised by someone who answered their questions honestly and let them explore the world at their own pace. She had learned to walk between rooms in the penthouse with a careful, deliberate tiptoe that she had invented herself and that Sophia found heartbreaking in its sweetness. This tiny person trying so hard to be good, to take up as little space as possible, to earn her presence somewhere she understood she wasn't technically supposed to be. On the morning of October 14th, Sophia arrived at 5:55, Lily bundled against the October cold in a yellow puffer coat with bare ears on the hood. Sophia settled her daughter in the break room with a cup of dry cereal, her beloved stuffed elephant named Peanut, and a picture book about a caterpillar. She kissed the top of Lily's head, breathed in the particular warm biscuit smell of her daughter's hair, and went to begin her morning duties. The kitchen was pristine, as always. The coffee machine's green ready light glowed in the dim room. On the marble counter beside it sat the carafe that Ethan had already prepared, the rich aroma of the Ethiopian roast drifting through the air like something beautiful and entirely trustworthy. Sophia glanced at the carafe, noted it, and moved to the adjacent utility closet to retrieve her cleaning supplies. She did not see her daughter slip out of the break room. She did not see Lily pad across the kitchen floor in her sock feet, drawn by the smell of something warm and interesting. She did not see the moment that changed everything. But Ethan Harrington did. He came into the kitchen at 6:03, still in his charcoal dress shirt from the night before, his dark hair uncharacteristically uneven from a hand run through it too many times during the phone call that had kept him up until 2 a.m. He was thinking about the quarterly projections. He was thinking about the 7:15 with his legal team. He was thinking, at some shallow peripheral level, about the coffee. He was not thinking about the small figure standing on her tiptoes at the kitchen counter. Lily had both tiny hands wrapped around the handle of the carafe. Her expression was one of profound, concentrated effort, the face of a person doing something that matters very much and requires every available resource. Her barrier hood had slipped sideways. One sock had a small hole at the heel. She looked up when she heard him. Their eyes met. And then, with the solemn, unhurried decisiveness that only very small children possess, the certainty of someone who has not yet learned to doubt their own instincts, Lily picked up the carafe, waddled 3 steps to the sink, and poured every drop of Ethan Harrington's coffee down the drain. The silence in the kitchen lasted approximately 4 seconds. They were, Ethan would later reflect, 4 of the most disorienting seconds of his adult life, and he had lived through a hostile takeover attempt, the death of his father, and a Category 4 hurricane that had grounded him in a Miami airport for 19 hours. He stood in the kitchen doorway and stared at the small child holding an empty carafe with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has completed an important task, and he felt something happen behind his sternum that he didn't immediately have words for. It wasn't anger. He'd expected anger when he registered what she'd done. The ruined coffee, the broken ritual, The delay. The anger had assembled itself somewhere in his nervous system and then simply failed to arrive, displaced by something stranger and softer. "You poured out my coffee," he said. Lily looked at him. She had her mother's eyes, that particular quality of calm steadiness, though in her 3-year-old face it read less as weathered composure and more as the absolute, unshakable confidence of someone who has never yet been given a reason to doubt that the world is fundamentally manageable. "Bad," she said, and pointed at the drain with one decisive finger. Ethan blinked. "Bad. Bad," Lily confirmed. She set the carafe down with a small clunk and looked at him with the expression of a professor who has just summarized a complex theorem and is waiting for the student to catch up. He crouched down, not quite sure why, bringing himself to her level. Up close, she was even smaller than she'd looked from the doorway. A tiny person in a yellow coat with a bear on her head, holding her ground in someone else's kitchen with absolute composure. There was a small smear of something orange on her left cheek. Probably cereal. "Why is it bad?" he asked. He wasn't sure why he was asking a 3-year-old to explain herself, but something in her certainty made him want to understand it. Lily's brow furrowed in the effortful way of someone reaching for words that are just beyond comfortable reach. She pointed at the drain again. Then she scrunched her nose and made a face, a small, precise face of unmistakable disgust. "Smell wrong," she said. Ethan felt something cold move through him, brief and inexplicable, like a door opening somewhere in his chest and admitting a current of air from a room he hadn't known was there. He glanced at the empty carafe, looked at the drain, looked back at the child. "The smell was wrong," he repeated slowly. Lily nodded with the gravity of confirmation. It was at precisely this moment that Sophia appeared in the kitchen doorway. She saw her daughter standing at the counter. She saw the empty carafe. She saw Ethan Harrington crouched in front of Lily with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not the expression she'd braced herself for, which was cold displeasure, the kind that meant phone calls to Patricia and the end of a job she desperately needed. This expression was something else. Unsettled. Almost wondering. "Oh God," Sophia said. It came out very quietly. "Oh, Lily. Baby, what did you do?" She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and scooped her daughter up, and Lily went willingly, wrapping her arms around her mother's neck with the automatic ease of a child who trusts that particular set of arms above all others in the world. "Mr. Harrington, I am so sorry," Sophia said. Her voice was steady. She had learned to keep her voice steady under pressure the way some people learn to keep their hands steady, through practice and necessity, and the knowledge that falling apart is something you do later, privately, when the situation has been resolved. She was in the break room. "I didn't see her come out. I'll make you a fresh pot immediately. I'm so sorry." "Don't." The word came out with more force than he'd intended. He straightened up, and Sophia took an instinctive half-step back, tightening her arms around Lily. "Don't make another pot," he said. More carefully this time. He looked at the carafe, at the drain, at the small girl who had looked at his morning coffee and decided, with the uncomplicated authority of pure instinct, that something about it was wrong. "Not from that carafe. Actually, don't touch the carafe at all." Sophia stared at him. "I know how this sounds," Ethan said. He ran a hand through his hair, that gesture of exhaustion she had noticed in him before, in the brief moments when she'd been in his vicinity, the gesture of a man carrying something very heavy. "But your daughter just told me the coffee smelled wrong, and I'd like to know if she was right before I dismiss it." Sophia looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Lily. Lily looked back at her mother with complete serenity, one hand patting Sophia's shoulder gently as though comforting her. "She does have a very good sense of smell," Sophia said finally. There was the faintest tremor in her voice that had nothing to do with fear of losing her job anymore. I've noticed it since she was a baby. She can smell things I can't. She told me the milk was bad once, 20 minutes before I would have given it to her, and she was right. Ethan nodded slowly. He was looking at the carafe again. I'm going to make a phone call, he said. And I'd like to ask you not to leave the building until I've made it. He called Marcus first, and Marcus called the head of building security, a former FBI agent named Carl who had joined Ethan's personal security detail 3 years ago and who had spent those 3 years hoping, in the professional way of people in his position, that nothing would ever actually happen. Carl arrived in the penthouse kitchen within 7 minutes. He looked at the carafe. He smelled it carefully with the particular focused attention of someone who has been trained in exactly this kind of assessment. His expression changed in a way that was subtle and deeply alarming. Don't clean this kitchen, he told Sophia quietly. Don't touch anything. I need to call someone. What happened in the next 2 hours unfolded with the controlled urgency of people who have contingency plans for things that most people believe will never actually happen to them. A private toxicologist arrived. The carafe was taken away in a sealed evidence container. 2 men from Carl's network went through the kitchen with methodical, expressionless thoroughness. Building security footage from the previous 48 hours was pulled and reviewed. Ethan sat in his living room through most of it. At some point, someone brought him a cup of coffee from the cafe 3 floors below in the building's lobby, and he held it without drinking it while the quiet, efficient machinery of crisis response moved around him. Sophia sat on the other side of the living room with Lily in her lap. She had read the Caterpillar book twice. She was now reading it a 3rd time, her voice low and even, while Lily turned the pages with careful fingers and occasionally glanced at the men moving through the kitchen with the unsurprised curiosity of a child for whom the world is still primarily a source of interesting information rather than threat. At 8:17 a.m., Carl came and stood in front of Ethan and told him what the preliminary testing had indicated. Ethan listened. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he looked across the room at a 3-year-old girl in a yellow barrier coat who was pointing at a picture of a cocoon and saying something to her mother in a small, serious voice. She smelled it, Ethan said. A 3-year-old smelled something wrong in my coffee. Kids pick up on chemical compounds differently, Carl said. Their sensory processing is. I know, Ethan said. I know. He was quiet for another moment. She saved my life.
Carl didn't argue with that.
Because it was precisely, simply, and completely true. Ethan Harrington had not allowed himself to be vulnerable in front of another person since the morning he had stood at his father's hospital bedside and held the old man's hand while the monitors went quiet. He had decided, in the weeks after that loss, not consciously, not with deliberate intention, but with the deep, wordless certainty of someone building a structure to survive in, that vulnerability was a resource he could not afford to spend. He had an empire to run. He had a name that meant something. He had a board that watched him for weaknesses the way predators watch a herd for the limping one. So he had built his fortress well. It had no obvious walls, no visible gates. From the outside it looked like confidence, capability, self-sufficiency. It looked like success. Nobody who sat across from Ethan Harrington in a boardroom suspected there was anything fortified about him, because fortresses aren't supposed to look like fortresses. They're supposed to look like home. What he had not accounted for was a 3-year-old girl with no concept of fortresses whatsoever. After Carl finished briefing him, and the forensic team settled into their quiet, procedural work, Ethan stood up from the couch and walked across the living room to where Sophia sat with Lily. He was aware, distantly, that he was not sure what he was going to say. He was even more distantly aware that this uncertainty was unusual for him. He was a person who always knew what he was going to say. He sat down on the coffee table across from them, a piece of furniture that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and looked at Lily. Lily looked back at him.
Hi, she said.
Hi, he said. She considered him for a moment with those dark, steady eyes. Then she held out her stuffed elephant toward him with the solemn generosity of a child offering something precious. Peanut, she explained. Ethan looked at the elephant. It was well-loved, its gray plush worn soft in places, one button eye slightly lower than the other, a small patch on its ear that had been stitched with blue thread by someone who cared more about the repair lasting than about it being invisible. He reached out and took it gently, the way you take something you understand to be important.
Thank you, he said.
Lily nodded, apparently satisfied. She leaned back against her mother's chest and regarded him with the companionable ease of someone who has just decided you're all right. Sophia was watching him. She had stopped trying to read the caterpillar book. Her arms were wrapped around her daughter, and her expression had the careful quality of someone who is paying attention to something significant, but is not sure yet what it means. I owe her my life, Ethan said. He looked up at Sophia when he said it. I want you to understand that I'm not saying that as a figure of speech. I know, Sophia said softly. Carl explained. He stopped. Looked at the elephant in his hands. She didn't hesitate. She just knew something was wrong and she did something about it.
She's always been that way, Sophia said.
There was a warmth in her voice when she talked about her daughter that Ethan found himself paying close attention to, not analytically, the way he paid attention to things in meetings, but with a kind of unfamiliar hunger, as though it was a sound he hadn't heard in a very long time and hadn't realized he'd been missing. Even as a baby. She would fuss before I could detect anything wrong, and then I'd find it, a seam in her onesie rubbing her skin, or a smell in a room, or something that just wasn't right. I used to joke that she came with better sensors than I did.
She does, Ethan said.
He looked at Lily again. She had reclaimed Peanut and was now carefully adjusting the elephant's trunk with the focus of a surgeon. She absolutely does. What happened next was not something Ethan had planned. He was not, as a rule, a spontaneous person. His days were structured to 15-minute intervals. His decisions were layered through analysis and consultation. He did not do things without thinking them through. But he found himself saying, Are you hungry? Has she had breakfast? A real breakfast. Sophia blinked. We had something before we came, but... Let me take you both to breakfast, he said. Downstairs in the building or anywhere, wherever she likes. He paused, registered how strange this was.
Did it anyway.
I'd like to do something, and I realize breakfast it's not proportionate to what she just did. But I don't know what is proportionate, and I need to start somewhere. Sophia looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to read him. He understood, trying to figure out if this was some kind of performance, some rich man's attempt to convert a life-saving into a manageable transaction. He didn't know how to tell her it wasn't. He didn't have the vocabulary yet for what it actually was. He just knew that sitting across from this woman and her daughter, he felt something in his chest that his fortress had been specifically designed to prevent. He felt seen. Not by Sophia, though that was coming, though that was already beginning to form like weather on a distant horizon. By Lily. By a child who had looked at something meant to harm him and said, simply and without drama, bad. Who had looked at him, a stranger in an expensive shirt in an expensive kitchen, and offered him her most treasured possession without being asked. Okay, Sophia said quietly.
Yes.
Breakfast. Lily looked up from Peanut with the immediate, total enthusiasm of a child for whom the word breakfast represents one of life's primary pleasures. Pancakes, she asked. Ethan felt something move through him. Warm and unexpected, like sun through a window you'd forgotten could open. Pancakes, he confirmed. Definitely pancakes. The investigation moved quickly once Carl's network mobilized. By noon on the day Lily poured out the coffee, 2 of Ethan's senior board members had been placed under security surveillance. By 48 hours later, a man named Richard Kessler, whom Ethan had known for 9 years, whom he had trusted, whom he had promoted, had been arrested in connection with an elaborate scheme to remove Ethan from leadership of Harrington Global through means that were, the legal team confirmed with professional understatement, criminal. Ethan received this information in his home office on the evening of the second day. He sat with it for a long time after Marcus and Carl and the attorneys had left. The city moved below him in its vast, indifferent glitter, and he thought about 9 years of shared dinners and handshakes and the particular warmth of professional trust, and how thoroughly and cleanly it had been counterfeit. He didn't call anyone. He didn't pour himself a drink. He sat in the dark of his expensive, silent apartment and thought about a 3-year-old girl who had looked at something dangerous and known it, immediately and without deliberation, simply by the way it smelled. He thought about what it meant to have instincts that clean, that uncorrupted. He had spent 10 years in business learning to distrust instincts, his own and everyone else's. The market didn't care about instincts. Shareholders wanted data, analysis, strategic frameworks. He had become extraordinarily good at processing information through a particular kind of rational architecture that was enormously effective, and he was beginning to understand had left something important without oxygen. He picked up his phone, put it down, picked it up again. He texted Sophia, "I hope Lily is sleeping well. Thank you again. Both of you." He didn't expect a response until morning. He sat for a moment in the quiet. His phone buzzed. "She's asleep. She made me tell her the story of the bad coffee at bedtime like it was a fairy tale.
She's calling you the tall man.
I thought you should know." Ethan sat in the dark of his fortress and laughed, genuinely, suddenly, with the full-body surprise of someone who had forgotten that laughter could happen spontaneously for the first time in longer than he could remember. He began finding reasons to see them. This was something he recognized was happening and chose not to examine too closely at first, the way you don't look directly at something bright until your eyes adjust. Sophia continued her morning shifts. Lily continued accompanying her, now with Patricia's full endorsement, an endorsement Patricia delivered in a tone that suggested she was not entirely sure how they'd arrived at this new normal, but had decided to accept it with grace. Lily had claimed a corner of the kitchen as her domain. Sophia had brought a small mat and a basket of toys, and Lily would set herself up there each morning with Peanut and her books and an assortment of small plastic animals that she arranged in configurations that appeared to have complex narrative logic visible only to herself. Ethan started coming to the kitchen earlier. He told himself it was because his schedule had shifted. He told himself it was because he was reassessing his morning routine following the security review. He told himself a number of things that were technically true and also not the real reason. The real reason was that something happened to his nervous system when he sat on the kitchen floor next to Lily's mat with a cup of coffee from the lobby cafe and listened to her explain the social dynamics of her plastic animals. The bracing, relentless forward tension that drove him through every other hour of every day. The feeling of running from something very large while also running towards something he could never quite reach. It quieted. Not disappeared. Quieted. Like a frequency being turned down to a level where you could hear the other sounds. "Elephant is the boss," Lily explained one morning, holding up a small gray figure that bore a certain resemblance to Peanut. "Because Elephant remembers everything." "What does Elephant remember?" Ethan asked. He had his elbows on his knees. He had 17 minutes before his first call of the day. He did not want to move. Lily considered this with characteristic gravity. "Elephant remembers when everybody was sad," she said. "And Elephant remembers when they felt better. So Elephant knows it gets better." She looked at him steadily. "You know that? It gets better?" Ethan held the little elephant figure she'd handed him. He looked at it for a moment. "I'm starting to," he said. Sophia, at the counter behind them, did not turn around. But he saw her shoulders do something soft and complicated, and he felt the same current move through him that had been growing steadily since the morning a child with good instincts had saved his life. The current of something approaching, something that felt terrifying and necessary in equal measure. It began the way most significant things begin, not dramatically, not with a declared turning point, but through the accumulation of small moments that only reveal their shape when you look back at them from a distance. Ethan started asking Sophia questions. Not the careful, appropriate questions of an employer to a valued employee, but real questions. The kind that required real answers. He learned that she had studied nursing and hadn't finished. He learned about her mother's illness and the years of caregiving that had derailed the degree, and he saw in the straightforward way she described that period, without bitterness, without the performance of stoicism, just plainly, as something that had happened and that she had handled, the same quality of steady courage that he recognized in the way she held Lily, in the way she'd kept her voice level when she thought she was about to lose her job. He learned about David without asking directly. It came out sideways, the way these things do, in a conversation about Lily's bedtime routines and the particular challenge of being a person who wants to give a child stability when stability is a thing you're building entirely alone. She doesn't miss him, Sophia said, looking at Lily, who was asleep on the mat by that point, nap having claimed her mid-morning. She doesn't know enough to miss him. And I'm grateful for that, even though I don't know. I think she deserves someone to have shown up. Not for me. For her. She has someone who shows up for her, Ethan said. Every single morning. In a building where she's not technically supposed to be. Sophia looked at him. Something in her face shifted. Not the controlled, careful expression she usually maintained, but something underneath it. Something softer and less defended. You're different than I expected, she said. Than you expected from? From everything, she said simply. From someone like you. He thought about that for a long time after she said it. Not defensively, he understood what she meant and she wasn't wrong. He had been, for years, exactly the person the word billionaire calls to mind when people use it as a shorthand for a particular kind of sealed, high-altitude existence. And something had cracked that open. A carafe poured down a drain. A child's instinct. The gradual daily exposure to two people who existed in his space with a warmth and realness that made the fortress walls visible to him for the first time, and made him want to see the door. He asked her to dinner on a Tuesday in late November, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and he did it with far less poise than he brought to any other significant communication in his professional life. He fumbled slightly. He started the sentence twice. Sophia watched him fumble, and the thing that happened in her eyes was not pity, and it was not amusement. It was recognition. The sight of something she hadn't expected to see, a person revealing themselves, and it moved through her gently, like a change in weather.
Yes, she said. Just that. Simply.
What followed was courtship of the most unexpected variety. Unexpected because it was not elegant, not carefully managed, not the kind of thing that looked the way a relationship between a billionaire and a woman on his domestic staff is supposed to look in people's assumptions about how power and proximity work. It was not a Cinderella story, though Lily occasionally cast herself in that role with creative enthusiasm. It was two people who had both been carrying heavy things for a long time, learning slowly, and honestly what it felt like to consider putting them down. Ethan met Sophia's mother via video call, a woman named Carmen who had her daughter's eyes and a directness that made Ethan feel both warmly welcomed and very clearly assessed. Carmen watched him on the screen for a moment after the introductions and said, "You be good to my daughter and my granddaughter." Not as a threat, but as a statement of the terms of engagement, and Ethan said, "Yes, ma'am," with more sincerity than he'd brought to most major contracts. Sophia came to a company event with him in December, One of the charitable foundation galas that populated his calendar like obligations with assigned parking. And the thing Ethan noticed was not how she looked, though she was, in a blue dress that she'd clearly chosen carefully, and that was perfect, extraordinarily beautiful. What he noticed was how she moved through the room, without apology, without the particular kind of performance that the room expected from people who were unsure of their right to be there. She spoke to his board members like she spoke to everyone, like they were people, like their time mattered, but so did hers, like she had opinions and the opinions were worth hearing. Later he told her she'd been remarkable. She laughed. "I was terrified," she said. "But Lily told me before I left that I was brave and beautiful and that Peanut believed in me." "Peanut was right," Ethan said. She looked at him with those steady, warm eyes, and something settled between them, something that had been approaching since October 14th, something that now arrived completely and quietly and without fanfare. "I'm falling in love with you," he said. He hadn't planned to say it that moment. But the thing about having spent 10 years over-planning was that spontaneity, when it finally arrived with a clarity that felt like relief. Sophia was quiet for a moment. The winter city moved behind her through the window. "I know," she said softly. "I'm falling too." She reached over and took his hand. "I'm just making sure there's somewhere safe to land." "I'm working on that," he said. "Every day." She looked at their hands. "I know," she said again. "That's why I'm falling." It was a Saturday in March when Lily asked the question. They were in the kitchen where everything had started, having what had become an established weekend tradition. Ethan made pancakes. He had learned to make them specifically because of that first breakfast, because of the way Lily had said pancakes, with the totality of her hope in one word, because he had wanted to be able to be the one who made that happen for her. He'd had his kitchen staff walk him through the recipe 3 separate times and had practiced quietly, alone, until he got them right. He got them right now. Lily had certified this with the authority she brought to all assessments. She was sitting at the kitchen island, Peanut propped beside her plate, working through a stack with the focused dedication of a small person for whom pancakes represent one of life's primary joys. Sophia was at the counter with her coffee. Ethan was at the stove. The March light came through the floor-to-ceiling windows, soft and particular, the kind of light that makes even a penthouse look like it could be a home. "Ethan," Lily said. "Yeah, Bug?" She had started calling him that, Bug, inexplicably, though Sophia suspected it had originated in one of her plastic animal scenarios and migrated into real life with the unself-conscious logic of a child's internal world. He had accepted it immediately and completely, the way he accepted everything Lily offered, which was with the gratitude of someone who understands the value of what's being given. "Are you going to be my daddy?" The kitchen went very still. Ethan turned from the stove. Sophia had set down her coffee. They looked at each other across the kitchen, a look that covered a great deal of ground very quickly, that contained the memory of October 14th and every morning since, that held the weight and the warmth of everything that had grown in the space between two people who had been broken in different ways and had, somehow, found in each other the exact right kind of repair. Lily was watching him with her mother's eyes, steady, direct, completely unafraid. She had maple syrup on her chin. She was holding her fork with the earnest grip of a child who wants to make sure you understand. She is asking a real question that requires a real answer. He crossed the kitchen, crouched down to her level, the way he had that first morning, looked at this 3-year-old person who had saved his life with the simple, uncorrupted clarity of her instincts, who had offered him Peanut before she had any reason to trust him, who had told him, with plastic elephant in hand, that it gets better, so simply and certainly that he had started to believe it. "I'd really like to be," he said. His voice was not entirely steady, and he didn't try to make it so. "If your mom says yes, and if you say yes. Both of you." Lily considered this with characteristic gravity. I say yes, she said. Peanut says yes. He laughed, that full, surprised laughter that Lily had been returning to him since October, the laughter that proved something had healed. He stood up and looked at Sophia. She had her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were very bright. The morning light was doing something extraordinary to the room, or perhaps the room was finally becoming what light was always meant to find in it. Sophia, he said. He crossed to her. He took her hands. He had thought about this moment, had let himself think about it with a carefulness and hope that would have been unrecognizable to the man he'd been before October 14th. I know that what we are is not what anyone planned. I know it started with a 3-year-old and a carafe and instinct that neither of us can fully explain. But I also know that I am a better person in this kitchen on a Saturday morning than I have been anywhere in my life for a very long time. I know that you showed me what courage looks like, not the performing kind, the real kind. The kind that keeps going. The kind that raises a daughter like her. He glanced back at Lily, who was watching them with syrup on her chin and complete serene attention. I want to keep going. I want to keep going with both of you. I want to be worthy of what she did for me on that October morning. I want to be worthy of you. He reached into the pocket of his jeans. He was in jeans on a Saturday morning, in his kitchen, making pancakes, which was itself evidence of every miracle that had unfolded since October, and brought out a ring he had chosen very carefully, with Marcus's bewildered assistance and Carmen's enthusiastic phone consultation. Will you marry me? He asked. Sophia looked at the ring, looked at him, looked over her shoulder at her daughter, who had climbed down from the island stool and was now standing beside them with Peanut held aloft like a small gray totem of endorsement. Yes, Lily said helpfully. Sophia laughed, a laugh that broke and bloomed at once, that had tears in it and joy in it, and the particular freedom of a person who has been strong for so long and can now, finally, lean. Yes, she said. Yes. Later, much later, after the ring was on her finger and Lily had been allowed to hold it for exactly 30 seconds before Sophia reclaimed it with gentle firmness, after the pancakes had gone cold and been reheated and eaten, after Lily had fallen asleep on the couch between them with Peanut tucked under her arm and her barrier hood slightly sideways as though she'd fallen asleep mid-adventure, Ethan sat in the quiet of his penthouse and felt it differently than he ever had before. Not silent, not empty, not the expensive screensaver the city had been for years beyond the glass. The city looked like the world. His world. The one that contained a sleeping 3-year-old who had known something was wrong before any adult in the building did, who had acted on that knowledge with absolute simplicity, who had handed him an elephant and told him things get better and been, as it turned out, entirely right.